It is the early hours of 7th June 1943, and somewhere above the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, a lone RF de Havilland mosquito cuts through the darkness at 400 kilometers per hour. Below, the city of Dortmund sleeps fitfully, or what passes for sleep in a city accustomed to the wail of air raid sirens and the distant percussion of anti-aircraft batteries. The pilot and his navigator exchange no unnecessary words. Their mission tonight is not to drop bombs. They are not here to flatten factories or crater railway marshalling yards. Their cargo is far smaller, far stranger, and in the judgment of the men who designed it, potentially far more devastating than anything measured in tons of high explosive. Somewhere over the target zone, a canister tumbles from the aircraft's belly into the cold German air. It is unremarkable to look at. Smaller than a standard incendiary, lighter than a conventional bomb. It makes no great crater when it reaches its destination. There is no flash of orange fire visible from 30,000 feet, no column of smoke rising to mark its impact. To any observer on the ground lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to witness its arrival, it would appear to be nothing at all. A dud, perhaps, a piece of jettisoned equipment, something to be reported, collected, and handed over to the appropriate authorities. That assumption would prove to be precisely the point. What had just been delivered into the water supply catchment area feeding Dortmund's municipal treatment network was a product of one of the most unusual research programs ever undertaken by British military intelligence. A program so obscure that it would not receive serious historical attention for decades. A program whose files remained partially classified long after the men who conceived it had died. It was called, in the dry bureaucratic language of wartime Whitehall, a biological and chemical interference operation against municipal water infrastructure. The men who actually worked on it in drafty laboratories and converted country houses had other names for it. Some called it the quiet weapon. Others, with the particular dark humor that seems to accompany all genuinely dangerous things, called it the gift that kept giving. This is the story of how Britain attempted, and in several documented cases succeeded, in turning Germany's own water treatment infrastructure against its civilian and industrial population. It is a story that sits at the intersection of chemistry, microbiology, psychological warfare, and the kind of cold, strategic calculation that wars produce in otherwise ordinary men. It raises questions about what constitutes a legitimate weapon of war, questions that were uncomfortable in 1943 and remain uncomfortable now. But above all, it is a story about ingenuity, about what happens when a nation with its back to the wall decides that the rules of conventional warfare are a luxury it cannot afford. To understand why this program existed at all, you need to understand the particular problem facing British strategic planners by the middle years of the war. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was, by 1942, consuming enormous resources for results that were, at best, debatable. The famous Butt Report of August 1941 had delivered a verdict so damning it had been initially suppressed. Only 1 in 4 aircraft claiming to have reached their target had actually dropped their bombs within 8 kilometers of the designated aiming point. Over heavily defended cities in the Ruhr, the figure dropped to 1 in 10. Even as bombing accuracy improved with the introduction of navigational aids like G and oboe, the fundamental problem remained. German industrial capacity was proving far more resilient than pre-war theorists had predicted. Albert Speer's armaments ministry was reorganizing production with extraordinary efficiency, dispersing factories, rebuilding damaged facilities with a speed that repeatedly confounded Allied intelligence estimates. The famous Dam Busters raid of May 1943, magnificent as it was in execution, had achieved far less lasting industrial damage than initial reports suggested. The Möhne and Eder dams had been breached, yes, but German engineers had restored partial water supply to the Ruhr industrial region within a matter of weeks. It was this last fact, the rapid restoration of water supply, that drew the attention of a particular working group within the Special Operations Executive and its Scientific Advisory Network. If water was so critical to industrial production that the Germans could mobilize thousands of workers to restore it within days of catastrophic dam failure, what would happen if the water itself became the problem? Not an absent resource, but a present danger. What if the infrastructure the Germans were so desperately protecting could be made to work against them? The industrial Ruhr consumed water in almost incomprehensible quantities. Steel production alone required roughly 270 liters of water per kilogram of finished steel. Water for cooling, water for processing, water bound up in every stage of manufacture. A single large munitions factory might draw millions of liters per day from the municipal supply, and all of that water passed through treatment plants, facilities designed to make water safe, but which, under the right circumstances, could be made to do precisely the opposite. The working group, which included chemists seconded from Imperial Chemical Industries, microbiologists from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and at least 2 engineers with pre-war experience in municipal water infrastructure on the continent, spent the better part of 6 months asking a question that sounds simple but proved extraordinarily complex. What substance, introduced into a water treatment system, would survive the treatment process sufficiently intact to cause meaningful disruption downstream while remaining difficult to detect and harder still to attribute to deliberate contamination? The answer they eventually settled upon was not a single substance, but a family of compounds. And the solution they reached was, in its way, a work of genuine scientific originality. The facility where the core research was conducted was Porton Down, the government's chemical and biological defense establishment on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, though significant theoretical work was also undertaken at a requisitioned manor house in Buckinghamshire, whose name remains, even now, absent from most official accounts. The team was led, insofar as any wartime scientific committee can be said to have a single leader, by a man referred to in surviving documents only as the Director of Special Applications Research, a title that appears to have been invented specifically to obscure his identity. Post-war researchers have suggested, with reasonable confidence, that this was Dr. Harold Templeton, a physical chemist who had worked on industrial catalysts at University College London before the war, and who died in 1971 without ever having given a public account of his wartime work. What Templeton's team developed was elegant in concept and fiendishly difficult in execution. The problem with most obvious contaminants, heavy metals, conventional poisons, biological agents, was that water treatment plants were designed to remove or neutralize exactly these categories of threat. Chlorination, which was standard practice in German municipal systems, would destroy most bacterial agents. Filtration and settling would remove particulates. pH adjustment would precipitate many dissolved metals. The treatment plant itself was the enemy of the weapon. Templeton's insight was to stop thinking about the weapon as something to be introduced into water and to start thinking about the treatment plant itself as the weapon. Specifically, he focused on the chemistry of chlorination. German water treatment facilities used chlorine gas, dissolved in water, to disinfect municipal supplies, a process that, at the correct dosage, was entirely safe and effective. But chlorine chemistry is sensitive. Certain compounds, introduced upstream of the treatment plant in sufficient concentrations, would react with the chlorine during the treatment process to produce trihalomethanes and related organochlorine compounds. These reaction products would then pass through the remainder of the treatment process, largely unaffected, entering the distribution network in the treated water. The genius of the approach, and the reason it consumed so much research time, was that the precursor compounds used were themselves largely harmless. They were not, in any meaningful sense, poisons. They were organic compounds, some derived from naturally occurring plant material that would not have triggered any contamination alert in a standard inspection of the raw water supply. The contamination occurred inside the treatment plant through entirely normal chemical processes, and the products emerged in the treated water as an apparently routine consequence of chlorination. At elevated concentrations, yes, but within ranges that a moderately overworked or under-resourced testing program might plausibly miss. The delivery mechanism went through several iterations. Early prototypes involved liquid canisters designed to be deposited in river catchment areas by agents on the ground, a method that proved impractical given the difficulty of operating agent networks in the heavily monitored Ruhr region. The eventual solution was aerial delivery. Sealed containers, roughly 45 centimeters in length and weighing approximately 3 kilograms, designed to rupture on impact with water or soft ground and release their contents as a slow-dissolving solid matrix. The containers were manufactured at a facility in the West Midlands, the precise location described in surviving documents only as the Coventry Annex, which has led some researchers to associate the production with existing chemical manufacturing infrastructure in that region, though this remains unconfirmed. Production numbers, inevitably, remain classified or lost. Estimates derived from logistical records, requisition orders for precursor chemicals, transport manifests, bomb dump inventories, suggest that somewhere between 800 and 2,000 units were manufactured between late 1942 and the end of the war, though it is unclear how many were actually deployed as opposed to retained for testing or destroyed as the program wound down. The operational record is where historical certainty becomes most difficult to establish, for reasons that are not hard to understand. Demonstrating that a particular incidence of contamination in a German water supply was the result of deliberate British action rather than industrial accident or equipment failure requires the kind of documentary evidence that both sides had strong reasons not to create. The British did not want operational details recorded in documents that might be captured. The Germans, for their part, had every incentive to attribute contamination incidents to industrial accidents rather than acknowledge a vulnerability in their civil infrastructure that they were powerless to prevent. What does survive in the historical record is suggestive rather than conclusive. German municipal health records, examined by researchers in the decades following the war, document a statistically anomalous cluster of gastrointestinal illness incidents in several Ruhr cities during 1943 and 1944. Dortmund, Duisburg, and Essen feature most prominently. These incidents were recorded at the time as outbreaks of unspecified gastroenteritis, attributed variously to food shortages reducing public immune resilience, to inadequate sanitation in bombed areas, and on at least 2 occasions to unspecified contamination of uncertain origin. A phrase that, in the careful language of German civil administration, suggests something that could not be satisfactorily explained by available means. Industrial records are more oblique still, but several Ruhr steel facilities reported periods in 1943 and 1944 when process, water quality, fell below specification, a condition that could force the temporary shutdown of particular production lines, since steel manufacturing tolerates very little variation in water chemistry. These shutdowns were recorded as maintenance issues rather than contamination events, which makes attribution essentially impossible. But the timing and geography are consistent with what British operational records, such as they are, describe as successful deployments. The psychological dimension of the program was, in some respects, more significant than the measurable physical effects. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Once German authorities became aware that their water infrastructure might be a target, and there is evidence from interrogation records that this awareness developed by mid-1943, the response consumed resources entirely disproportionate to the actual threat. Water treatment facilities in the Ruhr began requiring additional testing, additional personnel, additional chemical stocks. Civil defense planners had to develop contingency procedures for alternative water supply. Every unusual illness cluster prompted investigation. Every unexplained process failure prompted suspicion. An enemy that cannot trust its own infrastructure must spend as much energy managing doubt as managing the infrastructure itself. It is instructive to compare this British program with what German military science was doing in the equivalent domain. German chemical warfare research, centered primarily at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and various army ordnance facilities, was formidably sophisticated in certain areas. The development of nerve agents, including tabun and sarin, represented genuine scientific achievement of a terrifying kind. But German military doctrine, for reasons rooted partly in Hitler's personal aversion to chemical warfare following his own experience with gas in the First World War, was profoundly resistant to the use of chemical or biological means against civilian infrastructure. This was not squeamishness about civilians. The evidence of what Germany was prepared to do to civilian populations requires no elaboration here. It was, rather, a doctrinal preference for weapons that produced visible, attributable destruction. German military culture valued the clear causal chain from action to effect. A bomb crater is unambiguous. A factory reduced to rubble communicates a message. The quiet weapon, the contamination that presents itself as illness, as equipment failure, as bad luck, sat poorly with a military culture that valued decisive, visible force. The Americans, by contrast, were developing parallel programs at Camp Detrick in Maryland, but with a focus on agricultural sabotage, targeting food crops rather than water infrastructure, and with a biological rather than chemical approach that created different problems around delivery, persistence, and attribution. The British program's specific focus on exploiting the chemistry of existing treatment processes appears to have been genuinely original, and there is some evidence from post-war technical intelligence assessments that American chemical warfare analysts studied surviving British documentation with considerable interest. The Soviet Union's wartime activities in this domain remain almost entirely obscure. Given the scale of Soviet partisan operations and the sophistication of NKVD technical capabilities, it would be surprising if nothing comparable existed, but the documentary record simply does not permit any reliable account. Assessing the actual historical impact of the program is an exercise in careful qualification. The most honest summary is that it almost certainly caused meaningful disruption, probably caused some measurable harm to German industrial output in the Ruhr, and demonstrably consumed German civil defense resources out of all proportion to the physical scale of the operations involved. Whether it shortened the war by a single day is a question that cannot be answered, and anyone who claims otherwise is operating well beyond what the evidence supports. What can be said with more confidence is that the program contributed to a broader shift in British strategic thinking about what constituted a target in industrial warfare. The Dam Busters raid had demonstrated that infrastructure, not just factories, not just military installations, but the systems that made industrial society function, was a legitimate and potentially decisive target. The water contamination program extended that logic in a direction that was less photogenic and more deniable, but in some respects more sophisticated. It was warfare conducted at the level of chemistry and civil administration, rather than at the level of explosives and aerodynamics. The program formally concluded in early 1945, as it became clear that the war in Europe was entering its final phase and that the remaining German industrial capacity was being addressed through more conventional means. The relevant files were classified and remained substantially inaccessible until the 1990s, when a partial release under the Public Records Act allowed the first serious historical examination. Further documents were released in the early 2000s, though a small number of files remain withheld on grounds that, 70-odd years after the events they describe, seem more procedural than substantive. No surviving examples of the delivery canisters are known to be held in public collections, though there is unconfirmed speculation that examples may exist in the restricted collections at Porton Down or at the Imperial War Museum's off-site storage. Researchers who have inquired have received responses that confirm neither existence nor absence, which is, perhaps, its own kind of answer. Return, then, to that mosquito over Dortmund in the small hours of June 1943. The aircraft banks and turns for home, its crew knowing nothing of what will unfold in the days and weeks ahead. The slow, invisible chemistry beginning in a river catchment area, the reactions proceeding through a water treatment plant, whose operators noticed nothing unusual, the treated water moving through distribution pipes into factories and homes and hospitals, doing what treated water always does, except for what it carries now, embedded in the routine chemistry of chlorination, waiting. The crew will land at their home airfield before dawn. They will eat breakfast, file their report, sleep. Their contribution to the war effort on this particular night will not appear in any target assessment report, will not be photographed by a reconnaissance aircraft, will not generate a bomb damage assessment. There will be no dramatic signal intercept of German commanders reeling from the blow. The effect, if it comes, will come quietly, deniably, weeks from now, in an overworked doctor's notes about an unusual cluster of gastric complaints, in a production foreman's log recording unexpected quality failures in process water, in a civil defense coordinator's worried memorandum about the reliability of the municipal supply. This is what makes the program simultaneously so fascinating and so troubling to contemplate. It was warfare without a signature, violence without a visible perpetrator, disruption without a clear line between cause and effect. It was designed to be invisible, and it largely succeeded in that design. So completely in some respects that even now the full picture eludes us. Consider what the men who designed it actually achieved. They took the enemy's own infrastructure, the system built to protect public health, to make water safe, to sustain the industrial and human machinery of a modern state, and turned it, through chemistry conducted at the molecular level, into something that worked against its intended purpose. They weaponized trust. They made the ordinary dangerous. They turned the unremarkable act of turning on a tap into an act of unknowing participation in one's own disruption. The factories of the Ruhr produced steel and explosives and all the material of industrial warfare. The water treatment plants of the Ruhr produced the safe water those factories required. And somewhere between the river and the tap, in the controlled chemical reactions of a treatment process that no one was watching quite closely enough, a small group of British scientists found a space where a war could be conducted in silence. They were not celebrated. They received no Dam-Busters-style commemoration, no feature film, no commemorative flyover. The men and women involved, and there were women, researchers and analysts whose contributions are even harder to trace than their male colleagues, carried their work largely unacknowledged to their graves. The weapon they built left no craters and no monuments. Its legacy is measured not in rubble, but in disruption, not in destruction, but in doubt. And in the end, perhaps that is legacy enough. In a war defined by the spectacular and the catastrophic, someone in a requisitioned country house in Buckinghamshire, surrounded by chemistry textbooks and requisition forms and the particular quiet of wartime England, had the patience and the imagination to understand that the most powerful weapon available was not always the loudest one. Sometimes it was the one that arrived in the water. If you liked my video, please share your opinion in the comments box and subscribe to the channel. Also, turn on the bell icon so that the latest videos like this keep reaching you. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.